Hello, my name is Marcus Fisk, and today I'll be proposing the development of grid therapy capabilities on the XRAD preclinical radiotherapy system. My supervisors are Martin, Pejman, and David. I think there we go. So the structure of the talk will start with the background on what grid therapy is and an introduction into the XRAD preclinical radiotherapy system. Then the project aims and significance will be discussed, followed by a project plan and a brief overview of the literature. Grid therapy is a form of spatially fractionated radiation therapy, where instead of supplying a uniform dose to the tumor volume, intentional inhomogeneities are introduced where there are sharp dose gradients within the tumor, and an example of a grid used in a modern Linux setup for sale by Radiation Products Design is shown here, and the associated isodose distributions are shown. You can see that there are regions of high dose, and surrounding that there's regions of very low dose. So historically it was used for its skin sparing effects in orthovoltage therapies. This is because there was some skin that was received high dose, but due to the volume effect, the unirradiated parts could promote healing afterwards. So, however, in MV beams, and they have inherent skin sparing effects, so this technique stopped being useful for several years until it was, and now it's predominantly used for bulky deep-seated tumors. The reason this is the case is because large tumors are difficult to treat with traditional radiotherapy. The reason is, as the tumor size grows, the volume of normal tissue that has to be irradiated increases, and that puts a limit on how much dose we can give due to normal tissue complications. On the right here, we have a graph from a study in rats relating the tumor control probability to the volume of the tumor. As you can see, if the volume of the tumor passes a certain point, controlling the tumor with traditional radiotherapy is very difficult. So grid therapy tries to overcome this by treating a large treatment area and dividing it into multiple smaller fields. So the basis of this is that hopefully the normal tissues are less, or the tumor volume is, or the tumor killing of the cells is less affected than the normal tissue being benefited. So far there's been promising tumor results with minimal toxicity levels for these treatments. So there are some consensus on the radiobiological responses. It's a bit unclear as to what is exactly going on, but it's clear it has something to do with bystander effects, where there's intercellular signals from irradiated cells to unirradiated cells, and there's microvascular changes where endothelial apoptosis occurs in the tumor volume, and then immune responses. So there's quite a bit of research in this about the interplay between the immune system and the tumors being beneficially changed when only small fractions of the tumor are irradiated. So the XRAD Smart is the machine we have at the Telethon Kids Institute, and it was what we're going to be using. It's a self-shielded orthovoltage image-guided radiotherapy system. So it has a 360-degree rotating gantry, and it has an inbuilt cone beam CT system used for accurate tumor positioning. So it's a high dose rate isocentric treatment delivery that tries to mimic the traditional radiotherapy procedures. It has a set of interchangeable collimators shown here, and our collimators range from 1 millimeter diameter field size at isocenter to 4 centimeters by 4 centimeters square at isocenter. So it comes with a treatment planning system called Smart Plan, which allows you to import the CT and then contour to target shapes, then to plan beams, multiple beams to that target shape. You can have arc beams as well. The dose calculation is done by a Monte Carlo based EGGS NRC software, where it has phase space files which are for each collimator. So phase space files are basically a file that contain a subset of information about the expected particles in the beam. So things like their energy, their charge, their position, and their direction. So these phase space files are used by the Monte Carlo software to calculate where the dose will go. So after this has been done, the treatment planning system displays the dose distribution into the target and surrounding tissues. It supplies a dose volume histogram, which can be used for assessing the plan, and allows simple optimization of like beam weightings and things like that. So the aim of this project is to develop a set of grid collimators for use on the XRAD, and then to incorporate these collimators into the treatment planning system, the Smart Plan. So it's important that I ensure that the treatment planning system accurately represents what's actually coming out from the physical grid. And the significance of this is that it will hopefully allow further research on grid therapy, like its effectiveness on large tumors, or perhaps the radiobiological responses of this therapy. And for these, the end goal is to incorporate these findings into the clinical setting, because it's preclinical research that bridges the gap between in vitro radiobiology and clinical radiotherapy, which inevitably increases or improves radiotherapy for the future. So the research is going to be split into 3 phases. The first is the simulation, then manufacturing, and then testing the treatment planning system. So firstly, the phase space files for an open field without the grid will be produced, and this will either be done by using pre-existing phase space files or by simulating an electron source from the inside of the X-ray tube onto the target and going from there. Next is to produce grid geometries like those shown here, and pass the particles from the original phase space through that and score a phase space after the grid, so that it can be used as an input in the treatment planning system. And some grid optimization will be done by perhaps changing the radii, the hole spacing, or different grid shapes. And this will be done by looking at the profiles and the ratios between irradiated and unirradiated regions. And after this has been done, then a design of a grid mold, something like this, will be performed using specifications directly from the simulation. So then, when printing this, I have to make sure that the filament will not deform or produce a print that will not deform under high temperatures. The reason for this is the cerabend, a metal alloy, is going to be cast into the mold, and it has a melting point of 70 degrees Celsius, or just above that. And then I'll have to develop a way to mount the grid accurately. So if we go back to this slide here, you see this larger collimator. It has a slot to add a grid, or anything really. So that is what I plan to be using, so that will allow a fairly accurate and repeatable setup. Once this has been done, implementing the phase space files into the treatment planning system, I believe to be a fairly simple process with the Smart Plan. And then I will have to compare the physical output from the machine compared to what the treatment planning system expects, this will be done by film measurements at various steps. Okay, so here's some examples of grids. So there's the pencil beam grid here, and then a bar style grid there. So these will be assessed. So this is a simulation that I've produced with the help of David. So you can see that these grey cylinders are angled. They're air cylinders. They're angled with a beam divergence, and here's just a photon source, and you can see that the photon source is shaped as you would expect it to from the grid. So a brief overview of the literature. I've picked 3 papers that relate to different things in my project. One is the manufacturing of the grid, one is the Monte Carlo methods, and one is the grid optimization. So this paper by Zhu et al. Is where I got the idea to 3D print the mold. So they used a PLA filament, which they say is useful up until 230 degrees Celsius. So I will try and assess if that will work at a smaller scale, because this was for an MV beam. It's a lot bigger than what mine will be. So with the Monte Carlo aspects, the Granton et al. Have produced phase space files that they produce them by simulating the electron source on a target and passing those produced photons through the collimation setup and then scoring a phase space file. So they have also used the XNRC software, and some of their code or their setup for the simulations will be useful. So a paper by Timothy Johnson has produced grids pretty much exactly what I am looking for, except these are produced out of lead with non-divergent holes, and they were simply machined in there. So his paper assessed the kind of peak to valley ratios, which is the ratio of the dose in the open sections compared to the dose in the unirradiated sections. So this is a very important peak to valley ratio. Is important in grid therapy because the goal is to have as low valley dose as possible. So a high peak to valley dose ratio is required. So as we go from the left to the right, the hole spacing or the spacing between the beamlets increases, and he found that the peak to valley dose ratios increase as you move to the right, but it has a diminishing return after some point. So a kind of optimization should be done, and this will be easier using Monte Carlo methods rather than a physical method. He also found that pencil beam were produced better peak to valley dose ratios as well. So that is that. Any questions? Yes.
For the construction of the phase spaces, typically how long would that simulation take for one of those systems?
So it depends on whether I simulate the electron source or use pre-existing phase space files. So pre-existing phase space files probably not terribly long, maybe a day, but if I were to use the electron source, I think significantly longer, maybe 3-4 days.
So for this, the beam on the XRAD device, the smart device, what thickness of cerebend is going to be needed?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure whether I will try and aim to get the output similar to a megavoltage beam peak to valley ratios, because it's a whole lot easier to stop an orthovoltage beam than a 6 MV beam. So the amount of Cerebend used in this paper here is exactly what I'm going to be using, and it produced far better peak to valley ratios than MV beams. So that'll be the thickness of the Collimator setup is going to be this one here. That's going to be basically the thickness of the Cerebend, and that'll be enough to produce the required result, but maybe we'll even go thinner than that.
I noticed in that MV one, they poured it around the PLA, and then the PLA stayed there.
Yes.
Which might be a problem for the lower energy beam, but the PLA will attenuate the
Yes.
beam. Would you have to get rid of that somehow?
Yes, we will. I was thinking of that, and I think just getting rid of it is the best option.
Marcus, have you ever think about radiating cell culture?
What's that? Oh, cell culture? No, we haven't. I think that's a cool idea.
In that paper you had where they simulated the XRAD,
Yes?
did they do some of the spot size? If they measured the spot size first? Because that's, when the electrons get accelerated, they don't go to a point, they go to a sort of a little region.
Yes, they did actually give us the diameter of the electron beam used in the simulation. So that's effectively the same, or can be calculated using that. And they also gave the angle of the target. So.
So you're saying they used a PLA
Yes.
the mold. So PLA has like a glass transition temperature of like over 100, so it definitely can hold the Cerebend, which is what, around 70 degrees, you said?
Yes.
I'm just thinking though, it does kind of deform in structure a little bit, even around like 60 or 70 degrees. It's not really a question, but maybe it's worthwhile looking at some other filaments too, just to see if that affects the output of your end collimator or your grid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to see, if there's any defects in that from using such a soft material like PLA. Also, just a question: have you looked into what you think of using to model the mold?
So, you mean what software?
Yeah.
I've been using OpenSCAD. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Is that what you would recommend as well?
For something simple like that, yeah, and I saw that's what they used in that paper, so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, these are created in OpenSCAD,
Okay.
and if I just to create a mold, I guess I would just produce the negative of these,
Yeah.
and kind of
That's going to be really interesting actually, molding the Cerebend on the printed.
yeah, you can get involved if you want. Sound interested?
Thanks very much, Marcus.
Cheers.